Yeah. This is my friend and co-author of one of my books, Bill Rovell.
Hi, how are you?
I was delighted when he said he could make it today.
Yes.
I'm going to quote him.
Incidentally, regarding that material, I have 3 copies available for anyone who wants them.
Really?
$5
Wow.
for Xerox.
Well, I don't know copies of which, because I have a couple of things that I got from you.
Oh, regarding the stuff material.
Okay. Possible is the word I used. I have, to date, some 16 different dates that different astrologers think that Jesus might have been born. And 3 more days only, which came from Bill, which came from Edgar Casey originally. And one of the remarks made by Bill when he shared this with others was that the Akashic records appeared to be polluted with inaccurate data. When Casey himself, on 3 different occasions, said that Jesus was born January 6th at midnight, March 19th, and December 24 to 25, doesn't sound like he knew. The other thing that Bill was referring to was the Seth material. And Seth, as you probably, most of you know, was channeled by Jane Roberts, who was an extraordinarily good psychic and died some years ago. Just one of the penalties of getting too psychic. Psychic ability is sensitivity, and you get too sensitive, it's very hard on the body. So what Seth said through Jane, in a very small nutshell, was that there were a number of people that did some of the things that have been reported as done by Jesus. So what we have is a collection of stories from many sources. And this is definitely supported by the traditions of the ancient world. If you read any of the ancient historians, especially the skeptics, every stray magician and wandering skeptic was theoretically doing these kinds of things. There are stories in the Dionysian tradition of turning water into wine. There are stories of walking on water that come out of India, and supposedly any real adept was able to do that. And a variety of the other stories. For people who really want to believe that Jesus was the one unique and only Son of God, history is not very helpful. It shakes up our desire to believe in the uniqueness of this. Of course, the Hindu idea was always that periodically a person came into manifestation who was called an avatar, who had a special connection with the absolute, the infinite, which we usually like to call God. And that this was a periodic episode when it was needed by the world. That somebody came in and channeled, if we want to use that very commonplace word, the infinite in a new form that was more suited to the times. But increasing amounts of information is coming out now, especially from the work with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which really gives us a rather different picture of Jesus than the traditional one. Traditionally, he is pictured as the teacher for the Piscean age. Now, if there's one thing that Pisces stands for, it's inclusiveness. Pisces is the final oneness with the whole, where everything is connected, and we recognize that we are a part of the infinite, but so is everything else. That means if there were a Satan, Satan is also part of God. Anything we call evil is still part of the whole. Pisces puts it all together. And that is not what you see practiced and preached by most religions today. Very few religions are inclusive. Most of them say, I've got this little corner on truth, and my teacher, guru, son of God, or whatever, is the original and only and authentic one, and everybody else is outside. David Koresh is a horrifying example of what that can get carried to when you carry it to an extreme. My little band is going to be in heaven on the right hand of God, and everybody else is going to be thrown into hell. If you read some of what's being preached by so-called fundamentalist Christians today, I just got through writing my current issue of The Mutable Dilemma, my quarterly journal. One section of it is always called News Notes, which is just a lot of different little bits and pieces that I cull from everywhere, magazines, newspapers, and books and TV shows and whatever. But this particular thing comes out of a little newsletter from Washington, D.C. that is definitely on the liberal side. And this particular issue was quoting the agenda of the people who are calling themselves Christians. If Christianity is the Piscean age teaching, which I believe it is, this is a horrifying travesty on it. They want to stop abortion, so they force women to have babies they can't take care of. Then they want to stop welfare, so the babies and the mothers go out on the street, starve maybe. Then when the kids turn to crime to survive, when they become an adult, then they want to kill more criminals. So don't save them as a baby, as a fetus, a few cells, but then kill them when they become an adult. That's Christianity. So we have this problem, and if you go back into the material from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have really quite an amazing amount of, I think, relevant things that are being translated now and were finally released, thanks to the Huntington Library, which pulled the plug on the authorities who were sitting on this data for 50 years. And the Huntington Library had slides of all the originals. And when they saw that this thing was just going nowhere, they published all these things so everybody had access to the original material and could work on their own translations of it. But there's also the Gospel of Thomas. Some of you know about that one? Don't see many looks of recognition. Mm-hmm. This is a non-authentic, non-canonized gospel. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Acts of the Apostles, which were written by Paul and Luke, and the letters of Paul. Those are the ones that were accepted by the early church as authentic, revealed truth. Unfortunately, the fact that some of them have contradictions between them was overlooked. Like one of the Gospels, there are only two of the four that talk about the early life of Jesus, the birth. One of them says he was born in a stable. It was totally against Jewish law for humans and animals to occupy the same room. That was absolutely not done. And the other Gospel said he was born in a house. But those Gospels were accepted by the bishops in the 200s, 2nd, 3rd century, as the authentic ones, and everything else was considered not authentic. And there were once hundreds of little stories, that circulated about the people who had actually been with Jesus and known him. And the Gospel of Thomas was not one of the ones that was accepted, and it was lost for hundreds of years, over 1,000 years. But in this century, before the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was discovered, a copy was discovered in Egypt. And it's pretty interesting. It's just a bunch of sayings of Jesus. There is nothing in it about physical miracles, fulfillment of prophecies, announcement of apocalyptic kingdom about to disrupt the world order, no mention of dying for the sins of others. What he did say in this, among many other things, was the kingdom of God is within and without. And when what his disciples were looking for had already come, and they didn't recognize it. So if anybody wants to read a different slant on Jesus as a man teaching, can read the Gospel of Thomas. It describes Jesus as a sort of peasant Jewish cynic. The cynics, was a title used in those days for philosophers who wandered the countryside, speaking to anyone who would listen about their ideas, giving pithy aphorisms, little sayings that supposedly help people to live more effectively. They were more or less in the philosophical tradition of Socrates as a social critic. And in his sayings in this book, he and his followers, a small band that traveled with him, would be taken in by a home, and then they would bless that home, where they would be given lodging and food, and then they would shake the dust off with a home that rejected them and was not hospitable. And it's a picture of a human being who was aware that there were real problems in the society, and there were terrible problems at the time. The last couple of centuries of the past age, the pre-Christian era, and the first couple of centuries after that were totally turbulent times in Israel, Judea, Palestine, whichever name we want to give to that particular area of the world. There were a series of revolutions of the Jews against Rome, and sometimes successful. The Maccabees led a successful revolution, and well before the time of Jesus, and actually wrested control from Rome for a period of a few dozen years. And then the Romans sent more troops in and took control again. But for quite a while there was this unrest, and of course from the Roman point of view, the people leading these revolutions were terrorists. What else? They hung out in the desert, and they would strike at a limited number of soldiers where they might have equal strength, and a small group traveling on the backcountry roads, or they would strike into the towns and then retreat again to the desert. And modern, the name for them would be terrorists, fighting for freedom for their people, because Rome was pretty strong about if you're in the Roman world, you worship the emperor. The Jews said, we don't worship a human being. There's only one God, and we worship that one God. That's our God, our personal God. And it was a personal God belonging to the Jews. In fact, if you read the ancient Jewish law, if you think that they believed in the Ten Commandments, within limits, they believed in the Ten Commandments. One of the publications that I was looking at this past couple days, my son, Mark, says we have to keep up with the quote-unquote enemy. He gets a couple of different publications put out by people who call themselves skeptics. They are not skeptics. They are true believers in materialism. And anything that is not explainable by materialistic premises, the premises of materialistic science, is anathema. It's heretical. It's unacceptable. You don't even look at it. You look at it only to discount it, to try to disprove it. But this particular issue has an article about the evolution of in-group morality, and they look at those Ten Commandments, and specifically the Jews were ordered in those days, and this is pre-Christian, remember, that they were not to kill their fellow Jews. But it's all right to kill anybody outside the group. And in fact, the law very clearly stated if you killed a Jew but it was an accident, like you threw a rock at an enemy, a non-Jew, and it hit a Jew by mistake and killed him, you were innocent. You were not convicted because you meant to kill someone who was outside. That was all right. So that's the kind of world it was in those days. It was a very dog-eat-dog, conflicted and destructive world. And the Jews were fighting for their personal belief system, and they went up in smoke when the Romans came in and said, you have to worship the emperor. And there are stories about the heroism even of little kids who, in spite of torture, would not recant and worship a human being or a god other than their own. So in one sense, they were absolutely heroic, but in another sense, they were incredibly narrow, rigid, dogmatic, and parochial. They were non-Piscean. They were very Capricorn and Aries. God told them they could come into this country, which actually was occupied by someone else, and conquer it, because that was going to be their land. And they did. They took over Palestine from other people. And the Sumerians, who were very similar in many ways to the Jews in their beliefs, but just minor differences, were like bitter enemies. They were always at each other's throats, and one of the major revolutions that was going on, one of the major civil wars that was going on, was between Jews and Samaritans at one point. And the Roman overlord, the governor of Syria, was in control of the area, supposedly, and got disturbed by this, and this was early in the Christian era, while Jesus would have been still a child. So it was a very turbulent time, with the Jews fighting the Romans and fighting the Samaritans and anybody else. And the Romans periodically conquered them, and then they fought back, and then they got conquered again. There was one rebellion after Jesus' death in 66 A.D., I believe it was, 60, sometime in there. And then there was another one, 100 and something A.D. So this was a stormy period. And what has come down to us is very fragmentary history, because it was battles between rival religions, and you can call the Roman pantheism a religion, that they were out for the political and economic control, of course, and the Jews and the Christians, once they got solidified into a group, and they fought each other. So there were numbers of those wandering cynics at the time, and I think that's probably what Seth was referring to when he said there were a number of those people that wandered around and tried to tell people how they could live in harmony and peace with each other, and suggested that you need to share life with your fellow humans. At the same time, there were also these people leading the revolutions, the rebellions, and they had different names over the years. They were called sometimes the Zealots. That's the name that everybody's probably familiar with. They were zealous for the law, and the law was the law of Israel for Israelis, for the Jews. And so the Zealots were the ones who were zealous for the law and willing to fight anybody who stopped them from worshiping in their own preferred way. And they had a lot of other names, though. Somewhere here I have notes, but I don't know that you're interested in that kind of technicality anyway, about the variety of names. Oh, sometimes they were called Galileans. Where have you heard that before? Jesus called a Galilean. And sometimes they were called the son of the star. How's that? Very interesting. And sometimes they were called messiahs, the leaders of these revolutions. And Messiah just meant the anointed one. They had been anointed with oil. And they were specially consecrated by that anointment to lead the cause, whatever the cause was. But there were two kinds of anointments. You could be anointed as a descendant of Aaron, so you were a holy leader, a religious leader. And you could be anointed as a descendant of David, and then you were the king, destined to be the king, but more the political side of leadership. And there's more, if I can find it. But these were a variety of people who believed in their cause. And the Dead Sea Scroll area, which is we call Qumran, the modern name of that area by the Dead Seas, where the scrolls were found in caves. Qumran in those days was known as Damascus. Now there was also a Damascus in Syria. And the Damascus in Syria was the capital of Syria. And when Syria was enlarged to include the area of Samaria and Judea and the Idumean Empire also, and Herod, by the way, was an Idumean person who was brought in by Rome to rule the Jews. He was not considered a legal, authentic Jew. He was considered a usurper. And in 4 BC, he killed the final people who were the rightful inheritors of the throne. And up until fairly recently, it was believed that Herod died in 4 BC. But the latest evidence within the last 2 or 3 years is that he actually didn't die until 1 BC. 1 minus 1, 2 BC, which is, no, I was right the first time. I think it was 1 BC. Anyway, the reason for this is there was a man called Josephus, who was one of the few historians of the day in this Judean area. Mostly Rome was like, looking down their nose at these peasant kooks who were always rebelling for nothing. And they, in fact, their term for them was the godless people, because they didn't worship the Roman pantheon. They wouldn't worship the empire. They were godless. But they were pretty intensely religious, but for their small worldview. So at any rate, Josephus was a Jew who was captured by the Romans, and under threat of death, he became a turncoat. He became a spy for the Romans. So he reported from what was going on, and he is one of the few historians who has actual material that can be drawn on nowadays, until we started getting some of this Dead Sea material. And he says that the series of ceremonies, rituals that were performed, he describes them after Herod's death. This procession and all of these observances that had to be carried out to fulfill the proper ritual. And it was known and recorded that Herod died before an eclipse, and that the ceremonies for Herod's death were finished by the time of the eclipse. Now, until recently, it was thought that was the eclipse of 4 BC. And the reason that seems supported was because of the statement that sons of Herod took over the rule. One son in particular, but he was sort of provisional, tentative. He was on probation with the Romans to see if he could handle it. But if Josephus is right, the reason they gave that 4 BC as the date for someone else taking over the kingdom was to try to make it legitimate, because that was when the previous legitimate rulers had been killed. And Herod actually ruled until 1 BC. And there was an eclipse then, which was where the death would have been early enough before the eclipse to carry out all the rituals that Josephus describes. So that's where that information comes from. And also, there was the census was another item of history that has been used to try to time the date of Jesus. This is leading up somewhere eventually, to try to figure out even the year, you see, is in question about Jesus' birth, much less the day or the time. And where was I? The census, right. The census was around the time of 8 BC. There was a census by Augustus to count everybody. Now, the Jews were against that, too. They thought that was an illegitimate thing for him to do. He shouldn't know how many people there were, and the emperor should not be in control of them, and so on. But up until fairly recently, until this new information came out about Herod's death, most people, most astrologers who were looking at this, and most historians, were assuming that Jesus was born prior to 4 BC, thinking Herod had died then. And the Bible says Herod was alive when Jesus was born. And we have the story of the wise men, which was read, a bit of that was read this morning, the astrologers who came supposedly following the star, which may turn out to be a myth, as I said. But there was another time in 3 BC when Caesar Augustus ordered people to go to their origin, that is the town where their ancestors came from, to vote in some way approval of him and his reign. And it wasn't exactly a census, but it required people to go back to their home of their roots. And Joseph, the father of Jesus, did stem from the family of David, and Bethlehem was their home base. So that 3 BC order could very well be the one that is described in the Bible. And when the order goes out in 3 BC, it takes time for anybody to do it. So it was this was this trekking of people in to their home origin town was going on through 2 BC. And the date suggested for that is in 2 BC. And this is a very old and giving up newspaper clipping, LA Times from years ago, that is one astronomer's idea of how to bring an astrological key into the birth date of Jesus. But he's looking at this with this new information on Herod's death occurring later, and the possibility that that was when he might have been born in 3 BC or 2 BC. Now the astrological things that were going on at that time, well, before I get into that, the data that the astrology that most astrologers were looking at prior to this new work was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which occurred in Pisces in 6 to 7 BC. And I have a very nice book put out by ACS giving a whole bunch of charts from a whole bunch of people. This is where that original quote I mentioned from Bill Robel was in this. And it includes one of my charts when I was still working with the 7 BC date. And the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was in Pisces, so it was the beginning of a new cycling of those two planets through the 4 elements of astrology. Jupiter and Saturn were the furthest out planets to the ancient world. Without telescopes, they didn't have Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, or, of course, any asteroids, little planets. So they used those as their major timers. The first 4 signs of the zodiac represent the personal needs, the person surviving and meeting their own needs to be in the world. The next 4 are where we learn to relate to other people, face-to-face interactions with other people, interpersonal, to respect their rights as well as providing for our own. And the last 4 are the transpersonal, the infinite humanity, society, the search for abstract truth, God, the law, and so on. And Jupiter and Saturn each ruled 2 of those last 4 signs. So they were the 2 keys to the big scene, what was going on in the world at large. And when they were together every 20 years, regularly in their cycle, they were used as a keynote to the next 20 years until it came back again. And for about 200 years, they would go through the signs of a single element. So 200 years of fire signs, then earth signs, then air signs, and then water signs. And then every 800 years, plus or minus a little, because it isn't that precise, they would start the new element. Well, this was the movement into the water signs with the Pisces, a conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pisces. And so a lot of astrologers, I should say, were taken by that and said that must have been what the astrologers were looking at, because the Magi were, if there were such, they were astrologers. And they were following something that they saw in the sky or knew was going to be in the sky if they were genuine professional astrologers that knew what was coming. And if they were aware of those 200-year intervals through the different elements, they could have said, this is the time for a teacher to come in for Pisces. And in the Piscean age, of course, since then, I don't know that they knew about that at those days, but now we think that the Piscean age made this extra important, this general time. At any rate, most astrologers have looked at that, and all of the ephemerides, all of the charts of potential charts for Jesus, which are listed in this booklet, did come from 6 to 7 BC, and they also give an ephemera, so they give all the positions of the planets out through Saturn for people who want to play with it and work out their own. So it's a neat little booklet. But I had done one chart from that general time period, which I think I published in my journal in 1985, and then I ran across this new material, and that I published a chart based on that in 1989. And I don't want to bore you with too much of the technical stuff, but essentially what was going on in 2 BC was that Jupiter and Venus were in a very tight conjunction, and this was starting in 3 BC, And then Jupiter, which was the king planet, the Zeus, the ruler of the gods, conjuncted Regulus. And Regulus was the star associated with the king star. And 3 times in one astronomical year, Jupiter came back and conjuncted Regulus in Leo, the sign of the king. So this is the king star in the sign of the king, and Jupiter, the king planet, together 3 times. Now that would have been something the astrologers would have known in those days. They probably didn't know about the Piscean age and these 200 to 800 year cycles. They probably certainly didn't have a lot of things we have today, but they did look at the stars, the bright stars. They did use Regulus, they did use Leo, and they certainly thought Jupiter was terribly important. And remember, Jesus was theoretically descended from David, who was the king, from the line of kings, not from Aaron, who was the line of the priests. So remember, he could be anointed as a king or as a priest and be a Messiah, an anointed one, to be a leader of the people. So Jesus was in the king line. Now, after that, Jupiter retrograded back and forth, as I said, to make those 3 conjunctions. It was very close to Venus. Then in late August of 2 BC, 4 of the planets, Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and Mercury, all came together in an unusual combination known as a massing of the planets. And so this astronomer, this is an astronomer writing this, conjectured that maybe that's when the Magi, the astrologers, decided this was important. There really might have been someone really important born in the king line to be a king, a leader of the people, and went looking. So that's a possibility. Now, if the story of the shepherds is accurate, the birth wasn't in the winter. Shepherds were not out in the field with their sheep in the winter. It was cold. So it had to be spring, summer, fall, and a little more likely spring or fall. But then Martin and a lot of people think that the reason that the guy, whose name I've forgotten again, picked January 25th as the birth date for Jesus was because of the winter solstice occurred around the 22nd, 23rd of December. And that was a traditional holiday, pagan holiday. So by putting the birth date of Jesus to be celebrated as a Christian at the same time as a pagan holiday, it was easier to transfer your old habits into the new religion. But regardless of that, after that, then we take up another guy and his theory. And this is an astronomer also, but I don't remember, I never got his name actually. This was an article that was sent to me from Tucson, Arizona, a lecture given there in a planetarium in Tucson, Arizona by an astronomer at Christmas time when they talk about these things. And he had read Revelation, the book of John. And one of the things that John says in that book, and my personal opinion is most of the book is myth, symbolic. But he in Revelations, John says that the sun is described as clothing the woman, which suggests that the sun was somewhere between the shoulders and the knees of Virgo. Virgo, the constellation, was the Virgin. And the son born of a virgin could be this coming leader born of the sign Virgo, in the sign Virgo. Now, the time when this was possible, when the sun would have been in the sun in the sky, S-U-N, would have been in the right area of Virgo, would have been between August 27 and September 15th. So if John knew some astrology, which is possible from Revelation, and had some traditions from the past, that's a possibility. And then also John said that something about the moon being under the woman's feet. Now again, we're talking Virgo, and the only time that the moon was near the feet of the Virgo, the Virgin, was 2 hours, from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. on September 1st, 2 BC. So I said, well, what have you got to lose? I'm fascinated by these kinds of puzzles. So I looked for a chart that might look reasonable in that 2 hour period. and came up, of course, with a chart, which is still pure speculation, obviously, but I still like it better than any of the other charts I've seen, the 19 or so that have been speculated by other people. So if anybody wants to play with this, if you've got a computer that will produce charts for that long ago, it has to be local astronomic time. If you've got a computer that only does local mean time, it's not going to be right. It's going to be off a little, because local astronomic time was in use up until the 1800s when they brought local mean time in, and then the late 1800s they brought in standard time zones. So since then, most of us are on that. Anyway, what I'm using is 2 BC, which is -1 if the computer does it. We'll call it -1 because there's no 0 year. And I'm using 1913. I started out with 1912 and added 1 minute. So 1913, that's 7:13 p.m. and Bethlehem. So if you want a speculative chart to play with, that's my choice at the moment, but I really think that we'll never know. Now I could say a little bit about the chart. I get as the ascendant 24 degrees of Pisces, and as a midheaven 26 degrees of Sagittarius. Now, a little more about the history. Jesus may have been more than just a wandering cynic. The Romans did not crucify people unless they considered them a rebel against the state. Standard Roman practice in those days was anybody who was considered seditious, a terrorist who was advocating the overthrow of the state, was crucified, and thousands of Jews were crucified. A few women, mostly men. So the fact that they crucified him suggests they saw him as a threat trying to overthrow Rome. And the fact that a lot of this was going on, this rebellion was simmering all the time, as I said, for off and on for like 400 years, plus minus 200 years each way of Jesus' time. And what the Bible reports, and we do have only fragments of what happened, obviously, in the 4 Gospels. Jesus went into Jerusalem. Remember the temple and the money changers? Now, there's only a limited amount of information about that, but they say that he took over the temple and drove out the money changers. Now, somewhere I have some notes about... Yeah, here they are. The temple was huge. Many buildings, several great courtyards, measured 200 by 450 yards. There was a staff of 20,000 attendants. It was a public marketplace. It was a bank and a treasury. It not only had the temple guards, police guards for the temple, but a Roman garrison of 500 to 600 men. If Jesus took over the temple, he had a lot of men with him. It wasn't one guy with 12 disciples. Now, that's just a possibility. We don't know. But I'm still hoping we will get some more historical information in time. Anyway, this is a definite possibility that he actually appeared to be a threat to the Romans. So, after he left the temple, they captured him. And Mark it is who actually says Jesus held the temple day after day. And that seizure was what led, theoretically, that seizure led to his execution. And after that, then we have the visions of his followers who said they saw him alive. Now, of course, the materialists, and most historians are materialists, are saying, poo-poo, that's just their fantasy. They had this wild imagination, and somebody believed them. But anybody who's had anything to do with modern spiritualism, which started like about 150 years ago, knows materialists have done that. They have materialized bodies that could be touched. And modern healers, up till a few years ago, Kuhlman, Catherine Kuhlman was doing absolutely incredible, marvelous healings. I don't see any reason that Jesus couldn't have done all of that as a spiritual teacher. So I'm inclined to think he could have materialized to his followers afterwards, reassured them that life goes on, and it was their faith in that that gave them the courage to continue with the movement that eventually became Christianity. And the leader of the Christians in those days was the brother of Jesus, James. Not the Apostle James, but the brother of Jesus, who was named James. James the Elder. He's often called James of the Righteous. And he continued to lead a group of Christians in Jerusalem, and they were in contact with Qumran, the source of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was in those days called Damascus. Now, you remember Paul. Paul was anti the Christians. He was a devout Jew. And he was sent to Damascus, according to the report, with an authorization to arrest and charge the leaders there of being against the traditional Jewish traditions. At that time, Syria had not yet been given power. That came later after the next revolution, that Syria actually had power over this. So the Damascus that Paul went to was not Damascus, Syria, it was Qumran. He was headed for the Dead Sea Center when he had his epiphany on the road, his revelation experience of seeing Jesus, and turned instead into being a follower instead of an opponent of Christianity. And my suspicion at this time, and it's purely a suspicion, is that Paul is the one, whether or not it was ever Jesus' intent, I don't know, but Paul is the one who made Christianity Piscean, or more Piscean anyway than it was. Because James was a devout Jew. The leader of the group in Jerusalem was a devout Jew who insisted on everyone to be a member had to follow every jot and tittle of Jewish law. To be a member, you had to do that law, which is extremely Capricorn, very narrow, very rigid, very controlling of everything you do in life. And Paul opened up the doors to the Gentiles, to the pagans, to the non-Jews. Paul made it ecumenical. Now, he didn't go all the way. He still had this belief in hierarchy and male supremacy, and he was definitely down on sex and women. But he made it more Piscean than it would have been if it had stayed a small Jewish sect under James in Jerusalem. And at one point, and this is in Paul's Acts of the Apostles, at one point, the Jewish sect that would later be called Christian, but at the time they were not, actually came near killing Paul. There was a riot, and they were about to do him in as an apostate who was letting down the bars and letting in other people who were not obeying the law. And the Romans saved him. And they were going to throw him into the dungeon, but he was a Roman citizen. And he appealed to Caesar, and you know the story. He was theoretically sent to Rome and disappeared off the face of history. Nobody knows whatever happened to him. But while the records are still a little bit of records, he was treated very nicely by the Romans. He was hobnobbing with the people at the top, the wealthy, the in group. And so one author suggests that maybe Paul was like Josephus. He was actually a Roman spy who was trying to dilute this rebellious Jewish sect and make it more passive, more accepting, like you will be rewarded in heaven, very Piscean belief, and you shouldn't rebel now, you should accept the lawful civil establishment and just believe in God, and that will save you, and you'll get your reward in heaven. Who knows? Lots of questions, no answers. Anyway, that's more or less the picture. At this point, it's very much open-ended. We'll never really know when Jesus was born. I don't really think that's possible. But if anybody wants to look at this chart afterwards, I can stay for a little while in the room in the back today. I don't have an appointment afterwards, and at least not immediately. And so anybody that wants to, that knows enough astrology for it to mean anything, can look at it in the back room. I have a larger copy of it that is run on the computer that puts in a variety of things. We also have a possible date for the crucifixion, which has a little more historical support. This was worked out actually by a couple of scientists, and this, again, hinges. Everything hinges on some things that are questionable, whether it may or may not be really historical. But one story, I think was Luke, was that there was an eclipse when Jesus actually died on the cross, and that the veil of the temple was rent. You know, there was actually enough structural damage from an eclipse at that time that caused an earthquake, an eclipse and an earthquake together. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's one possibility. And Luke, I think it's Luke that says that he died at 3 p.m. So at any rate, these historians and astronomers worked out a possible date, and it was actually printed in Science News, scientific magazine, some years ago, because it was prior to when I did this article in 89. Well, I don't see it in here. I thought I had something on that. Anyway, they looked up possible eclipses, and the one that fit the situation was 33 AD. April 1 of 33 AD. No, April 3, sorry. April 3, 33 AD, and it's set up for 3 p.m. in Jerusalem. But that's equally speculative, but maybe a little more solid evidence if we believe the eclipse and earthquake report. And so I progressed this tentative chart for Jesus to the date of the crucifixion, and there are reasonable aspects that fit that possibility, but it remains pretty speculative. So that's the story until we get more from new documents being discovered. But the general picture we have now from the Dead Sea Scrolls supports this as a period of intense struggle.